artistry thereof, and you'll say a little more about that. But she was able to tell us, oh, Maitland Armstrong, which even our esteemed Elliot Lindsley wasn't quite sure who had done that. And our vestry notes from the time are all about how the rector doesn't need that carriage and horse anymore now that St. Peter's Lithgow has somebody else. So they didn't even talk about the window. It's amazing. They don't talk about it's being proposed, it's not debated, no information. So even our own Elliot Lindsley was unable to be definitive about that, which was amazing. We had this gorgeous window, and Brianne came in and said, well, I believe it's at Maitland Armstrong, and you'll tell more about that, and about her identification of the St. Martin window that's so beautifully lit in the afternoon sun right now, which was probably, late, probably by Helen. And then the beautiful rose window as you walked in, and she'll have images of that. And we are blessed to have these treasures, but we, in a way, didn't even know what we had. So, as I'm sort of treading a little bit while Alex is setting up. But I don't want Brianne to get going and then have it not recorded for prosperity. So, but I do appreciate your coming here, and so instead of while he's setting up, waiting to make the pitch, I'll make it now. If you haven't already read the article and thought about donating toward this effort, please do. It's a substantial amount of money. I think it was $68,000 was the bid we've accepted from the artisan company who is going to do the work that Brown will describe. And there's additional work both in masonry and some other preparation, as well as the soft cost of consultants and things like that, bringing us to something in the $80,000 range. Now, I'm so pleased to say that it's a lot easier to fundraise for a stained glass window than a parking lot. I have, you may notice we're painting too. Nobody has stepped up. People will hear about John in memory of John D. and Adelaide Wing, and it can be a continuing memorial to those who love the church, who love art, who love beauty, and as I mentioned in my article, gifts of $5,000 up will be on the plaque, which will be forever hidden behind the organ, so nobody will know. But you'll know, and we'll know, and of course any donation though will be wonderful and go toward this project. So I just thank you in advance for both being here, and Alex is giving me the heads up. Without further ado, Brianne Van Vorst.
Thank you. Hi everybody, can you hear me? Thank you very much for coming. As Father Matt said, my name is Brianne Van Vorst. I come from a background in art. I went to art school at Tyler School of Art at Temple University, and then I went on to graduate school where I specifically studied stained glass conservation and what the British call cultural heritage management. Here in the United States, we would call that historic preservation. I had to go to England for this because there's no education for the care of stained glass in America at all. So that's a really important thing to know. We could talk a little bit more about that later. When I came back from England, I worked for a private studio in northern New Jersey for a number of years, Northeast Stained Glass. I worked for a wonderful man. I had a wonderful experience. But there's a very big difference with how the British view and maintain their cultural heritage and the Europeans in general and how we do here in America. And I felt that deficit that gap could be bridged, and apparently I thought I was the one to do it. So I opened a consulting firm. So that exists specifically for folks like you, for architects, for liturgical settings, civic buildings, any building containing leaded, stained glass, old wood windows, etc. And I work to advocate for the care of the object itself and of course the client. So essentially what that means is whether a job is, $500 or $5,000, it does not affect my opinion because I'm not doing the work anymore. A contractor would be doing the work. So you get an unbiased opinion. So that's kind of how I function. Today we're going to do a 3-part discussion. I got a lot of questions about how the pieces that make up stained glass, what they are, how they interact with each other, how they all come together. And I think that there's sort of a deficit in our knowledge here in America about how and I hope I'm, speaking correctly, but I do get a lot of questions about this. So I'd like to start with how it's made, essentially, what the pieces are and how it's made. And then we will do a bit of an art historical conversation, because your window fits into the American opalescent era of stained glass, which is specifically unique to us. Stained glass did not change for about 1,000 years until the Americans revolutionized it in about 1880. So your window fits into that period of time, and it's a really very special one. So I'd like to discuss that. And then, of course, we'll talk about conservation and what we plan on doing to conserve your window. As I said, stained glass did not change for about 1,000 years. Glass has existed for a very long time. The Mesopotamians had glass, the Romans had window glass, but it was not made into stained glass, and the apex of stained glass is considered to be the medieval period, as I'm sure a lot of you know. What we know about medieval glass is very important. It comes from this book here on the left. A 12th century monk by the name of Theophilus went around and recorded painters, glassmakers, and metal workers, exactly what their process was and the best way to do it. And what that reveals really is that how we make stained glass today is really not much different than how the medieval craftsmen were doing it. I want to talk to you a little bit about medieval windows. There's two examples of those on the right. Beauty was, of course, important. It always was. But in the medieval period, these were primarily functional objects. They were keeping out the cold, they were keeping out the rain, they were allowing light into very dark, medieval stone buildings. But they also, some scholarship suggests that they were Bibles for the illiterate, because a lot of folks couldn't read. So these images helped with mass for people to understand what it was that was going on. I've chosen these two medieval panels on the right. They are from a 14th century church called All Saints North Street in Yorkshire. They depict a poem it's a Middle English poem called The Prick of Consciousness. This is the only known stained glass rendering of this poem. It's about, the medieval folks really liked the Apocalypse, Book of Revelation cycle, so they tend to be a little terrifying. In this poem, the trees are weeping blood and fire is coming from the water and the dead come up from the ground, so it's very terrifying, and which is what you're seeing on the right. But what I really want you to see here is that you really have three main colors. You have blue, you have red, you have yellow, and then of course the clear, which looks white here. Medieval windows had one layer of glass, and it is a type of glass that is transparent or semi-transparent. You can see right here, there's some little lines. It looks like a net. That's an actual net on the exterior of the building that kind of keeps out birds and whatnot. So you can see that through the window because it's, somewhat transparent. So there's three main components to a stained glass window, of course. The first component being glass. So originally, medieval windows, they're made of something called antique glass. And what that means, we still make antique glass today, so it doesn't necessarily date to a period of time, but it's about how it's made. So glass contains a former, a flux, and a stabilizer. Today, that is sand, soda, and lime. I promise that's the end of the chemistry. But this was the earliest type of glass that was installed in windows. It could also be referred to as hand-blown or mouth-blown glass as well, sometimes cylinder glass. And really what the process was is that your three ingredients were put into a kiln and heated up until the point where they were molten. You see this little gentleman here, this is an antiquarian drawing from the 17th century, who has taken his blowpipe and gathered, it's called a gather of glass on the end of the blowpipe. Here he is blowing it into a shape. Gravity then helps when you pull the pipe down and you swing it back and forth, so it becomes a cylinder. The cylinder is laid flat, it is cut with an iron instrument, and ultimately becomes a sheet of glass. This doesn't happen quite in this linear fashion. The glass is constantly being back and forth into the furnace to keep it hot enough to be able to manipulate it. And what the hallmark of antique glass is it creates a very imperfect surface. Parts of the sheet are thicker than others, so it catches light in these very beautiful natural ways. If you have a historic home with double hung wood sash windows, it's very likely that you have some type of antique or mouth-blown glass. The crown process is where you get these roundels right here, which is a very similar process, and you can see this little guy back here blowing a crown roundel. Colored glass was just not enough, so very early on we started adding chemicals to make glass yield color. So for example, Copper can get you red, cobalt will get you blue, magnesium will get you purple, so on and so forth. But what's important about this is that this means that the glass is inherently colored all the way through. It is not stained. We will get to what stain is, but this is important because the glass is inherently colored all the way through. And of course, ultimately, humans, we work smarter, not harder. The mouth-blown process at one point became sort of cumbersome, expensive, time-consuming, so they figured out how to manufacture it. So instead of gathering the glass on a blowpipe, it was poured on an iron table, which you can see here on the top left, and driven through a series of rollers. And this would produce sheets of glass. Over time, they started adding texture to the rollers, and you can see multiple examples of that. The textures have names. There's ripple, there's hammered, there's cat's paw, there's water glass, there's all these types of colors and textures. At a time when stained glass was so popular, there was so many companies making these, and a lot of these rollers were proprietary. When those firms went under, the rollers disappeared, and now it's very hard to match those as a conservator today, and it makes a lot of the glasses very special. The second part of a window is the metal matrix, which holds it together. Traditionally, this was lead. Later on, we were using zinc and copper. Your window's lead, so that's what we're going to focus on here. Lead comes in long strips of cane. And you can see, although they can have many different profiles, what they all have in common is a heart in the center and a flange at the top and the bottom. The pieces of glass are inserted on either side of the heart. Here's a window that's being re-leaded. And you can see the long strips of cane are being wound around the individual pieces of glass and held together with nails. Once you get it all together, you solder the joints, and that creates the matrix, or essentially a basket that holds it all together. Glass decoration. So now this is where we get the term stained glass. So people have kind of started to attribute the term stained glass to any type of colored glass anywhere, when in reality it only becomes stained glass, true stained glass, when it's decorated. There's a couple different ways to decorate glass, but what it really means is paint. The basic kinds of paint are something called grisaille, which is what you see here on the left on God the Father's face. This is a 15th century window from York Minster, and the grisaille is everything you're seeing. So these curly little lines, the lines above his eyes, the eyebrows, and glass paint, when it is applied, before it is fired, is very brittle, so you can scratch pieces away to create different types of texture. Glass paint, grisaille paint, is essentially ground up glass with some other ingredients to turn it into a paint. It comes in a powder, you add a vehicle and a binder, you get a paint-like consistency, you paint it on and you fire it. The middle image is showing you silver stain. Silver stain is really the namesake of stained glass. This was begun to be used in the 14th century, and it's silver nitrate that is mixed with a medium and applied to the glass and fired. The silver ions actually dye or stain the glass yellow. Silver stain can range from a lemony yellow to a deeper amber. It can be a little unpredictable, but this was huge for the medieval craftsmen, because now, by applying silver stain to blue glass, they can now get green, and so on. They were creating more colors without having to individually cut these tiny little pieces of glass. And on the right is the third type of paint we're going to talk about today, which is enamel. Very similar to grisaille, comes in a greater range of color. It fires at a lower temperature, and it's a very thin layer that's applied over a larger surface, so it tends to be fragile and break down over time. So now that you know the basic components, I want to talk about how these are assembled to make a window. Any project starts with you have a client and an artist, of course. The artist gives the client a design. So on the left, we're seeing the design. Typically, these are in watercolor. I believe the photograph is in black and white. This is from a museum, so that's why it really would be in watercolor. It's actually a Maitland Armstrong design, which is the maker of your window. After the client says, yes, I love it, move forward, then that little design, which you can see here, is turned into what we call in the stained glass world a full-scale cartoon. So that's the one-to-one size of exactly what it's going to be. This is not only important because it's the artistic rendering that is going to ultimately be painted, but if you'll notice, this just looks like a beautiful, charcoal or painted sketch. Here, you're seeing all the lines in here that will ultimately be where the lead is placed. So this is telling you where to cut the glass, what shape to cut the glass, what size to make the lead. And of course, you have to be mindful of where you put the lead. You don't want it to go right through St. Christopher's head. So you have to make very careful, thank you, very careful decisions about where to put it. So this is important because in America, there's this belief out there that lead is somehow less important than glass. That is untrue. It is inherently part of the design from the beginning. So the next step is to choose the glass. Sometimes the artist does it, sometimes the client does it, sometimes it's a mixture of the two. And then that cartoon that we showed you is turned into, another stained glass term, a cut line. And that is what this person has right here. So the design elements, the paint that goes on the face and the background and all of that is removed. And these little thin lines signify the heart of the lead. So it ultimately is cut into a pattern. It has to be so carefully and exactly cut. If every one of those pieces, or even some of those pieces, are just a hair too big, when you put the window together, it's going to be bigger than what you had originally planned, which is A, embarrassing, and B, it's not going to fit. So it has to be very carefully executed. Cutting the glass, back in Theophilus' day, they were using an iron heated in a forge that they would run over the glass and then hit with cold water to cause a reaction to make it break. Thankfully, we don't do that anymore. I tried it in graduate school. It was very, very difficult and a total nightmare. Now we have diamond wheeled glass cutters to make our lives easier. So here's the artist using a diamond wheeled glass cutter to cut out one of the pieces from her pattern very perfectly. So the next stage is painting on the glass. Once we get all of the pieces cut, which is what you're seeing there on the left, they're all laid out, the painter will then begin the process of painting. Glass paint can be layered, it could be fired multiple times. It is really, in my opinion, I'm not a glass painter, I know quite a few glass painters, and the amount of patience and just intelligence that you need to be able to map out how many firings you're gonna do, because once it's fired, it's fused on, it's permanent. To be able to have the forethought to plan that out from the beginning and get the desired effect that you want is just really an incredible task. It's also a little bit finicky. Sometimes you fire these things 8 or 9 times and get them exactly how you want, and then they crack in the kiln and you have to start again. So it takes a really special person to be a glass painter. After the final firing is complete, all pieces of the window are leaded together. Now we're looking back at one of our older cartoon designs, which show you where the lead lines go. Here's our cane being placed in and our nails. Once it's all, this is me back in my days on the bench, so there's proof that I did it. Once the panel's together, you solder every single joint on both sides, and that makes your matrix. Weatherproofing is an extremely important part of the process. Weatherproofing in stained glass is whiting, calcium carbonate, and linseed oil, and sometimes a black dye to make it dark. And you have to push the weatherproofing putty under all of the lead flanges on both sides, and this is what keeps them from leaking. So it has to be very carefully done. As you can imagine, linseed oil is oily. It leaves a grease behind. So either sawdust, like you see here, or more whiting is then poured onto the window, and you have to buff it and polish it out so it's not all greasy and fingerprinty. The setting, so there's a couple different ways to set it. You either have wood or stone generally. Sometimes there's steel casements and whatnot. But so wood settings is what you have here in your church and possibly in your home. There's a wood rabbet. There's a wood rabbet. The stained glass panel is set into it and tacked into place. Sometimes there's a wood molding on the outside that does that. In a stone setting, there's a stone groove that is put in by the mason. One side of that groove is deeper than the other. You figure out which side that is. You shift your panel into the deeper side and then center it back. The setting is super important because this is when your support system comes into place. You can see it here on this diagram that there is a round bar that is called a saddle bar typically, and they go into your framing system and are also attached to the window by wires. Bars are even though there's all these beautiful, amazing things that I'm discussing, bars are really important because they carry the weight of the window. And if your bars are too small or they fall off or they don't exist, windows will fold in on each other. So bars are extremely important. So I found this quote: innovation is taking two things that exist and putting them together in a new way, which it was apparently said by Tom Freston, the co-founder of MTV. I'm not a super huge fan of Tom Freston or anything, but this quote is really helpful for what I'm about to tell you, and it's really indicative of the next stage of the process. America is the land of innovators. It really always has been. No one does it like we do it, frankly. So as I said, stained glass didn't change for 1,000 years until we got here, till the Americans really got their hands on it. And the 1880s, late 1870s onward is the American period of glass, the opalescent era. Two things created this for us here in the United States. They revolutionized the technical and aesthetic process. So the first one is opalescent glass, which is what you're seeing on the left. This material, going back to my quote, this material existed prior to this period in time, but it was not cut into, rolled into sheets or cut for use in windows at all. So going back to the antique glass where I pointed out that you could see through it, opalescent glass is semi-opaque and milky, so you do not see through it in the same way you would see through translucent colored glass. The second distinctive American innovation is something called plating. So instead of having one layer of glass, as you saw in the medieval windows, this kind of broccoli-shaped piece will show you it's sitting proud of the pieces behind it. It was an additional layer added. There are plated windows, I've heard, up to 7 layers thick. There are ones that are 1 or 2 layers. There are ones, all manner of ways. But plating allows you to control color and atmosphere and create depth in windows. That was something that was harder to do in the past. I did mean to tell you, opalescent glass is created through crystallization during the cooling process, and it refracts and scatters light in a different way that transparent glass would. The two gentlemen that we have to thank for this are John Lafarge and Louis Tiffany. A lot of people tend to say Tiffany style glass, and I encourage people not to because it was really John Lafarge who did this. He came up with the idea sooner. I guess him and Tiffany were friends at one point. Tiffany saw it in John Lafarge's studio very early on, and he went off and did it as well. And Tiffany had the ability to commercialize in a way that John Lafarge never did, so this style of glass came synonymous with his name. But we can't forget about John Lafarge because he was a huge contributor. I also just want to mention about these gentlemen that they were both artists, painters. They did interior decorations, mosaics, stained glass, true artist craftsmen in every possible sense of the word. So their creativity and this new use of materials really created some incredible artwork that we had not seen up until this point, like these. So how I was telling you, medieval windows are primarily a functional object. They keep you warm and dry and add in light. Opalescent windows kind of changed that. So although they're still doing those things, they, instead of being the vehicle to allow light to come into a building, they're almost using the light to better illuminate their artwork. These are pictures in glass. They are no longer windows, really. Technically, yes, of course, they're functional objects, but we have made paintings now with glass. And in the medieval window, almost every single piece in those windows that I showed you was painted. They had to render all the little faces, all the background, all the architectural details. John Lafarge and Tiffany and Maitland Armstrong didn't have to do this because between plating and opalescent glass, they could create the designs they wanted simply through color. So this on the left, John Lafarge, Spring, the personification of spring. I really like this one, that's why I added it. I like the upward trajectory of the figure. I think the painting is beautiful. The only paint on here is the flesh. The flowers, the background, the robing, every other thing is made just from glass and lead. And I like the motion here and how the petals are falling. I'm getting kind of lost in my own sauce, but it's a really just incredible window. On the right you have, I included Spring because John Lafarge I think really excelled, this is my personal opinion now, but John Lafarge really excelled at figures, whereas Tiffany really excelled at landscapes. I'm sure you've heard of the wonderful Tiffany landscapes. So on the right, this one here is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You may have seen it before. There is no glass paint in this window at all. All of that design is rendered just through glass and the matrix that holds it together. So as you can imagine, this was completely revolutionary. It's really unfair to juxtapose two completely different images next to each other because it's hard to not think one's better than the other, but truly they are both so important in their own right. But I chose a medieval window on the left, which is a group of figures, and an opalescent Tiffany Studios window on the right, which is a group of figures, and showed you how this period of time was so different than anything anybody had seen before. Between the amount of color, the amount of texture, the depth. I mean, he has a whole mountain scene back here with some foliage in the middle ground, then your figures, and then you even have foliage in front of that. So this is an incredible amount of depth. The painting is much more realistic. Of course, with enamel, they were using more heavily enamel. There's a little bit more of a range available to do that type of work. And I also wanted to choose a later window. So on the left, you have Heaton, Butler, and Bain, who actually made your Good Shepherd window as well. So this is they're a Victorian firm. This is a later work for them, 1907. But this is pretty much contemporary with John Lafarge on the right of Dawn Comes on the Edge of Night. So single female figures, completely different styles, colors. What Lafarge is able to do with the creation of movement, there is glass paint in the portion of the figure, but all the rest of this color comes from glass and plating itself. So you can see why people really went wild over this at the time, because it was just so eye-catching. You could sit in front of these things for hours and find something new every few minutes. So I want to talk about your windows now that I've given you a little bit of a background. So David Maitland Armstrong, he went by Maitland Armstrong on the left. He was a friend of both Lafarge and Tiffany and managed to balance that for all of his career, because those two were at constant war with each other. So everything I've ever read about Maitland Armstrong, he was a very mindful, well-mannered, all-around good guy. He did a lot for the American arts movements in general. He pushed for artists that were maybe not so well known in international competitions. He was involved with World's Fairs. He just really did a lot for this movement, as well as painting in general. He was the American consulate in Rome, as well as a gifted artist, as I said, and also a lawyer. So he did work for Tiffany for a number of years, and ultimately he went out on his own and ultimately incorporated his daughter, pictured on the right, in the firm. Together, their method of work provides a superb example of the American School of Stained Glass. They each had very specific roles. Maitland generally chose the concept, the architectural decoration, some of the border work, but Helen painted the figures. I recently read that he had submitted, and I think it was a World's Fair, he had submitted a window for it, and the critics really liked it. They said, you know, it's fabulous, but the one thing that is a little less than fabulous is your figure work. And it seems like from that time on, Helen started painting all of his figures, and they were just wildly successful. He was also, Maitland Armstrong was an incredible master of color. He knew exactly what colors to put next to each other to create a field of depth, which you will see. So, of course, they completed your north choir loft window, a memorial to John D. Wing and his wife Adelaide, and of course it depicts Christ in the garden with Mary Magdalene. Here is John and Adelaide's final resting place at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. I don't know if there's any Wing family members here, but if you would like to visit, please let me know. I also work at Woodlawn, but we are looking for information. So if anybody has information about the mausoleum, please let me know. And although I know you've read the article that Father Matt and I put together, but I'll be brief. John Daniel Wing is among the Wings of Dutchess County. He boldly sailed to San Francisco in 1885 for the gold rush and went into business. He returned to New York City and started a chemical import business in 1858 when he married Adelaide Hinman. Although his business is really successful, it also seems like his marriage was. In addition to being a businessman and a farmer, he was a devout churchman. He gave 3 beautiful windows to the First Grace Church. And of course, you know, their family has also donated 3 beautiful windows to this church. So I want to go back to the typical iconography that we see. So the do not touch me or noli me tangere scene is in art from a very early period. So this is a 13th century book illumination. Here's Christ, here's Mary Magdalene. This is 13th century, we have 14th century, 19th, and later 19th. So pretty much spanning art. I picked these examples because they're all kind of different from each other, but they have a really important few things in common. Mary Magdalene is always kneeling. Christ is always standing. He is not touching her. The marks of the crucifixion are often showed in these windows. And there's a lot of forward movement of Christ, of a step back type of pose. Your window does none of that. So I was at 2 stained glass conferences and art historical conferences last month, one internationally and one here in New York. And I talked to 15 art historians, medievalists, right up through Tiffany scholars. And when I showed them this window, they were like, wow, it's amazing. And I was like, it's Christ and Mary Magdalene in the garden. And they were like, no, it's not. I'm like, yes, it is. Father Matt said it is, and I'm not going to argue with him. So they looked at the inscriptions and they were like, this is incredible. There are one or two very other obscure examples of Mary Magdalene standing, or we found one other of them touching, but it is exceedingly rare. So this was a lot of food for thought for us. Father Matt and I went back and forth a lot. I did take some convincing a few times because I got some alternate ideas. But although we're still doing some work on this, there's a couple things that I would like everyone to consider. So it's pretty well documented that Maitland Armstrong, when making a memorial, selected a theme that was related to the person to be remembered. Makes sense, right? But it was his opinion, and this is a quote, that even as an observer, whoever knew the memorialized could understand something of his or her character by interpreting the window. So personalized possibly to John and Adelaide, right? But also, as we know, clients really rule the roost. So his children who donated this window might have said, we love the theme. Can we make it more about my parents? And it could have been client driven to perhaps make Mary Magdalene standing, and the holding hands is really what is so interesting here. It's right at the center of the window, so it's a focal point. Before that organ was there, and if you were standing here or even in the pews looking at it, the hand holding is right at the center. Your eye would have been drawn right to that. It is a really important part and kind of difficult to explain unless their children and Maitland Armstrong worked this out to be more personalized for the relationship of a husband and wife who would part ways in a much more tender way rather than the do not touch me that we're so used to seeing. So we're still working on this, but we'll let you know what we come up with. From a technical standpoint, the iconography of your window could have been further impacted by the reuse of cartoons. I showed you at the beginning the cartoons that Stained Glass Studios used. They often reuse them, work smarter, not harder, or pieces of them. So for example, here, this is Moses. You can see him with the tablets. This is from a synagogue I finished last year in Brooklyn, and figural representations are kind of odd in synagogues to begin with. So I reached out to a Jewish scholar and rabbi that I know and was like, can you just take a look at this? I have an instinct that something's off. He's like, oh yeah. And I'm like, what is it? He said, this gesture that he is using is not something you'd ever see in Jewish art ever. So he's like, I can't explain it. And I was like, well, I can. This firm probably had a Christ window with the exact same stance that they just added the tablets and changed the head. So it is possible that some elements of your window, particularly Mary Magdalene, could have been, with the lilies, to me, I see in a lot of stained glass window that's more of a virgin type of iconography. So there could have been elements of this that were added in. But I do think it was obviously personalized to John Wing and his wife. Oh, and I just put a little comparison of Christ doing the same gesture for you. So from a technical standpoint, your window is really special. So this is the base layer. This was the part that they first made. I've highlighted all of the lead came for you in yellow. So they put this together first. This is the majority of it. You could just see this and with all the glass, of course, included, and understand what the scene was meant to be. Then they added interior plates, which you're seeing in blue. The interior plates are very large, and they cover very large portions of the lead matrix. And then, for good measure, there's exterior plates on the outside, and that's what you're seeing in pink. These tend to be smaller and more localized areas, and I suspect really more heavily based on altering color in very specific regions of the window for whatever reason. So here are some details of that. Your interior plates are on the left. This is a sort of milky opalescent glass. This texture is called hammered. So these large plates are in front of sections of the glass, and it gives it a kind of ethereal quality. And then on the right, this is your exterior plate, and you can see it's sitting proud of the pieces behind it. This actually here is glass corrosion, which we will get back to. On the exterior side of your window, and then you can see another plate here. Does everyone understand the plating? Enough? Okay. We can go over it. So I really can't move forward without discussing Helen's incredible paintwork. this is all her. As I said, she painted the figures, but she really created her own style. That's why it was so recognizable to me when I saw that window, because I've worked with her windows before. You just know it. She did this wonderful cross-hatching technique and a lot of scratching out of glass paint before it was fired over and over again. It's a very soft quality. She was absolutely masterful, and this is really specific to her, a highly refined glass painting, very specific to her. She used enamel as well as grisaille, and I've seen silver stain in other of her windows as well, so she was not afraid to paint. There's a couple things that are very specific to Maitland Armstrong and Company, one of which is something called hanging plates, which we see here in your window. So here's Christ's foot, and this is his shadow. Nice soft shadow, very similar to what you would see if we were all standing outside. On the outside of the window, here's that same piece of nearly black glass. There is the lead cane, which holds it on at the top of the foot. If you'll notice, it is not at the bottom of the foot whatsoever. Instead, he soldered on these very little tiny lead feet to support it from the outside. He did not want to do a lead line at the bottom because you can see the lead lines here. It creates a very harsh line, a very clear line, where a shadow is something that fades out. So these are little tiny details that could easily be overlooked by someone who wasn't looking for it. But it's unique to Armstrong & Company, number one, and it is an incredible amount of work to make this happen, even if it's just in this one little piece. And it's something that I feared that if a contractor, maybe the wrong contractor, would have worked on your window, would not have seen this and could have changed it forever. Another really important thing to Armstrong & Company is Maitland Armstrong knew with these triple, quadruple, even more layers of glass that they're very big and they're very heavy. And without the adequate support that we talked about earlier, they're not going to make it. So they came up with this very ingenious way of creating bars that they could attach to their windows. So here's your base layer, if you remember the yellow diagram from earlier. There is a copper wire that is soldered to it, and then put through a lead grommet, which also acts as a lead cane truly, and through the front to tie to a bar. I'm sure it's a little hard to make out in this diagram, and I'm trying to explain it the best way that I can, but this is a very specific and ingenious way of supporting these windows, and it is actually right here. So this is the wire, and it's connected to the base layer underneath. It comes through the front plates and then twists around the bar, and there's many of these throughout to support the window. So I see a lot of windows that are in much poorer shape than yours. So I want to tell you a little bit about what to look out for in terms of degradation, and of course what you have going on here and how we plan on fixing it. Glass and glass paint are susceptible to moisture very much. I mean, water is problematic. It erodes our shorelines. If you leave wood furniture out, it'll get it. Water's tough, and it interacts with glass and it causes degradation. This is a Tiffany window that's been outside for about 100 years, and you can see all these little pock marks, which are similar to the exterior plate on your window that I showed you before. This is a little bit more progressed, but it creates ultimately divots. It eats away at the glass over time. In the center, I'm really interested in this window. It is a mausoleum window at Woodlawn Cemetery. I've looked at hundreds of windows at Woodlawn, and this is the only one that I found so far that's the bust of the person interred. And it's almost like a marble, what a marble bust would be, but it's painted in glass. It's a very close portrait, but it's in sad shape. The grisaille paint has been, deeply affected by water. So she looks a bit scary. Her name is Mrs. Rich, and we're hoping to get her conserved by the end of the year. And of course, it will affect enamel paint as well. All of this stuff is made of glass, so it's affected in the same way by water. As water will affect glass, it will also affect metal. Iron will rust. So here's copper foil that has been deeply affected by water. You can see that it's all chewed up and degraded. And here, of course, is lead cane as well that's suffering. White powdery substance on lead cane like this to this degree is generally a sign of lead carbonate, which is a byproduct of oxidation, really. It is powdery, it can become friable, and it's very dangerous because you can inhale it. The linseed oil-based weatherproofing putty that I told you about in the beginning, over time, of course, the linseed oil will eventually dry out, and then the putty falls out, and if there's nothing on the outside, the water gets in and then your windows leak. So these are all the things that can happen. And lastly, lack of support. The Tiffany Annunciation on the left is at a church in the South Bronx. I think about this window every single day. It keeps me up at night. It is huge. It's about 35 feet tall. This building still has its original slate roof, which leaked for years and years and years, decades, and it went through the plaster wall and rotted this frame. So sometime in, I don't know, probably the early 90s, somebody had the idea to put these big steel braces across the window because the window is coming into the building like this. Unfortunately, those steel braces are not tied into the wall at all, so now they're just adding weight and helping gravity pull the window in. This is an extreme situation, but when things are not regularly maintained, and if they would have done a minimal amount of work years ago, it would not be the huge project it is now. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, a crane shutting down the street in New York City. I mean, it's a very difficult situation because regular maintenance wasn't, observed. And again, here's another one showing lack of support. This is it's not a very large window, but it is triple plated, so there's 3 layers of glass in most areas, and it only had these skinny little support bars and only 2 of them, and they just couldn't do the work. So here's the window, it's collapsing in on itself like a tapestry. And again, this is not something, it's in a mausoleum, so it's not looked at regularly, so I think it probably was just under the radar. In congregations like yours, clearly you guys are doing regular maintenance here, so. But lack of support in general, this is how it can go wrong if it's not managed. So conservation, in general, as a conservator, the sort of tagline is do no harm. Anything you should do, anything you can do should be reversible always. There's always going to be a new me in however many years who's going to have a better idea and more science to do it better. And if we remove original material now, we're never going to be able to undo that. So we want to do that basically never if we can avoid it. So you see Christ in the garden. There's a little hole here. A rock went through it, a landscaper, it was an accident. Luckily, the piece was on the sill. And of course, you see some glass paint loss in Christ's beard and hair and in the sun right here. So this is the process after conservation. We did not even have to take the window apart. The piece was glued, we just took out that one piece that was affected. It was essentially glued back together with an epoxy resin. And we used a material called gold size, which is something sign painters have typically used on outdoor signage, mixed with glass paint for the color. And it's painted on the exterior of the window and it's reversible. We also put in a very nice laminated protective glazing to keep the window safe from further rocks and also to help the gold size live on its life as much as it can. I will say, disclaimer, the color looks very different. This on the left, it was, first of all, it was clean, so that will help. But on the left, it was shot in the morning on kind of a rainy day. And on the right, it was a beautiful sunny day when I took the picture. So I can't help that, but it is all the original pieces. So what will we be doing to your windows? The first thing we're going to do is clean it. So this is 2 panels. The one on the left, there are 2 pieces that go together. The panel on the left has not been cleaned, and the panel on the right has. All we did was use cotton, conservation grade soap and water. It makes a huge difference cleaning. Dirt and dust will sit on the surface of windows and it creates a texture for water molecules to just cling to for longer. So that cleaning is very important as long as it's undertaken by the right people. This window is taken apart. It absolutely had to be. Your window is not being taken apart. So that makes, because it doesn't need to be because your lead came is in good condition, but that makes cleaning a little tricky because now the conservator is going to need to use cotton swabs and individually clean both sides of the glass while it's all intact. So they definitely have their work cut out for them. As far as your plates go, the inside interior large plates can be removed without having to take the window apart. So we can get and clean in between the plates. These plated windows tend to get, when water runs down them, it brings dirt and you get dirt in between the plates and it's very distracting. So we can clean that up without seriously modifying the lead matrix. We are going to repair your cracks. So these are border pieces from Trinity Wall Street. On the left is the before, and on the right is the after, same two pieces of glass. Again, we used an epoxy resin called Hextol, has a very high refractive index, very close to clear glass, and you really can't tell the difference, and you really can't tell where it was broken. And what's so important is that these are your original materials, so the value, the inherent value in the original materials is still present. So this doesn't look like much, but I'll walk you through it. So I've been telling you that water is an issue. So what are we going to do? We can't control the weather. So even if we put protective glazing on it, much like you have now, unvented protective glazing creates a very hot interface. It could get wet in there. It could stay wet for longer. It can create condensation on the stained glass. But we also need that secondary glazing because it provides, you know, a secondary thermal layer for the building. And it's also protection for the window. So the best possible thing we have at our disposal is something called isothermal glazing or environmental protective glazing for stained glass conservators. And what that is essentially is internal ventilation. So this is a wood frame window. This is actually Moses from earlier. And at the bottom, if you can make them out, there are these very small little vents that were put into the wood frame at the top and at the bottom. So that allows heat and air to flow up in the chimney effect and also down depending on the type of year. And what that does is it keeps both sides of the stained glass window pretty equal in temperature and minimizes any possibility for moisture to sit on the window. If we do get condensation, it'll be on the protective glazing. So that's what we want to see. We want to keep your window dry. By doing this is a form of preventative conservation. What that means is we are keeping your original materials, we are extending the possibility of its life indefinitely. Everything has an end date, right? All materials have a serviceable life and eventually it comes to the end. But isothermal glazing is what they're using in medieval windows with original lead and they're still intact. And those are windows from, 1400. They're using isothermal glazing techniques to keep those things intact for many years to come. So it's the best thing that we can really do here, and we don't have to take apart your window and remove any original material. And of course, any artwork is not successful without a really robust, successful frame. So we are going to take all of the lead paint off your old growth lumber frame, which is in very good shape. The paint needs to come off. It'll be tidied up, sanded. Any repairs will be done and it'll be resealed. You will be getting new laminated glass protective glazing, again, to protect the window, which is what you're seeing here. I'm hoping to be able to engineer it with less divisions. And of course, there's some masonry work, as Father Matt mentioned here. There's definitely some water getting in here, so we want to mitigate that. And last but not least, we're going to flip it around and backlight it so we could all enjoy it from the outside. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
I was curious how it gets flipped around.
Great question. So I'm lucky because they're in wood sashes. So it's a wood sash and then a wood frame. So when we take the windows out, they'll be in their wood sashes. Those sashes are what will be modified to turn it around. So they might have to be routed slightly, they might have to be sanded slightly, but they will go back in to the opposite lancet. Does that make sense? Yeah. So we'll be modifying the wood frame slightly. Yes? In the world?
No, here. In the
3.
We've got the rosette, this one.
St. Martin, and yep.
And what kind of shape are they in?
So good. I mean, any windows that's 100 years old starts to bear some type of evidence of their age, but really good. The reason I got involved here, thanks to Molly, it's my understanding that you had a couple of proposals from contractors that were presenting very different possibilities, inconsistent with one another and very difficult to make out, and that's really what I do, is untangling all of that. And it has been said that these windows are not in great shape, but they are. They really are very good. There's maintenance that needs to be done, and of course preventative conservation that I just explained, but you have a very good collection here and in good shape.
When did it get covered by the organ? When did it
1968.
So that reminds me, although I don't love to see an organ in front of a beautiful stained glass window, it's actually a positive because it means nobody got their heavy-handed mitts all over it. It's still original. which is so rare, especially in well-loved congregations where people want to do maintenance. You know, you guys have done a lot of regular maintenance here to keep your building looking great. So when that happens, sometimes people are like, okay, it's time to do the windows, and then they just hire whoever, they take them out, they relet them, they change them, and that original material is lost. But yours hasn't been touched. So, and I'm trying to touch it the least amount possible and just do what I can to, you know, keep it in perpetuity.
So is there any archive, like the Helen Maitland Armstrong, any archive that you can learn more about families and donations? And also, have you done anything up at Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck?
No to the Church of the Messiah. Not because I don't want to, just because I don't know them. And so after David died, or excuse me, after Helen successfully made windows, I believe until World War II, I think, on her own. David died, and then Helen continued on with the firm, I think right around World War II or right after she dissolved the firm. And at that point, it's my understanding that she burned a lot of the records. A gentleman, a scholar called Robert O. Jones, who I have his book. It's all about the Armstrong family. He did a ton of research. He visited the family and found whatever primary documents did exist. I can totally recommend that book to anyone who wants it. But there's not a central repository, no. Corning Museum of Glass has some stuff. This is the problem with stained glass. It's scattered all over for information. For so long, it was only thought of as a building trade that happened to be pretty, that it was treated like one. When people bought, you know, $100,000 paintings, you better believe they have the receipt from Sotheby's, you know? Stained glass windows, the records on who made them, how much they cost, why, often don't exist, even in newer buildings. And it's a real shame. It makes my life a lot harder than it needs to be, trying to chase that down always.
What is the time frame that it would take for this type of?
For your window? Oh, well, Father Matt has a hard end date of Easter, so Easter.
You mean originally?
Oh, to make it originally or to conserve it?
To conserve.
To conserve it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we're trying to get it, just a note on the history. That window was not the first to Maitland Armstrong. And in fact, as was mentioned, the Wing family came and commissioned 3 windows in 1867 for the first church. They had an interest in good windows. That first church was burned down 3 years later by someone who really didn't like that sermon. And then they built the second church downtown, and then the Wing family were part of the church that whole time, because John D. Wing had returned to Millbrook, where he grew up as a solid Quaker going to 9 Partners School. Then he made, gold rush, came back, made money in the chemical import business, bought his old school, the 9 Partners, and built San Donona up here. And so he at that point had married Adelaide Hinman and become an Episcopalian. That's what we figured. I haven't learned much about Adelaide yet, but she was from Chicago, and he came back and got married, started his business, and bought the old house and built San Donona, and was part of the Grace Church right from the beginning. Well, he donated the land. This is the carriage house to the old San Donona estate is next door. And as Millbrook was put up in 1870 and laid out, the second church was there on Church Street and Merritt, where the parking lot near the DMV is now. But that wasn't the church that he wanted. He had often, I mean, walk forward and just continue. He often went to England as part of his chemical import business because he actually had the sole contract for this potash thing. I'm learning more about the process. And so he made a lot of money and was often in England, where he, I think, loved the style of building. And in that age, and Brianne can tell us a lot, that Gilded Age, there's just a lot of stone church and stained glass.
Certainly. I mean, the Gilded Age was, the time of Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. There was a lot. It was either the upper echelons of society or, people not meeting the poverty line. It was a very dynamic time in American history. So that was the backdrop for art in general. And the model, a lot of the times was this post-Gothic revival interest. I mean, I think this building falls under English arts and crafts. Yes. So there's a lot of interest, especially from being abroad. And even Maitland Armstrong, he was the American consulate for Rome. He spent a lot of time traveling. I mean, art was his passion, but I think I read that his parents were like art's not a way to make money, you'll be a lawyer. So he did become a lawyer, but he was able to return to art, and he made quite a significant business out of it. He was heavily influenced by what he saw in Europe and what other people were doing as well.
And so I think that the link system of patronage, because John Wing's New York, home and office was in New York City, and he lived in the same neighborhood as Maitland Armstrong, who grew up across the river in Newburgh. Mm-hmm. So this is, and the Armstrongs, Tiffany, they were good friends with Hakeem and White, and often came up to their place in Newburgh, Danskamer. So this was a group of people who knew each other.
Yeah.
And especially Maitland Armstrong, in his role as his wife was descended from the family that was Hamilton Fish. And so actually his wife's uncle was the first Hamilton Fish Secretary of State, and that's why he was consul in Rome in the 1870 period, able to meet all these artists and have this influence. So interesting social network behind this. The other thing I wanted to point out, and Brianne, you might correct me on this, but I read the Robert O. Brown biography of Maitland Armstrong and his daughter Helen. Well, Maitland was really super active. His health was declining by the 19 teens, and he died in 1916. Mm-hmm. And so we have, the first one is I think it's dated 1910. So the church was built in 1901. And clearly, these were, I was very fascinated by your kinds of window. Well, that's a certain kind of rolled window, the diamond pane stuff.
Oh yeah, it looks like granite texture maybe from here.
Yeah.
All these textures had names, and sometimes competing companies will call them different things.
So don't throw a rock through it. I guess it's hard to find. Huh?
Yeah, yeah. Diamond quarries are what that is typically called, the design.
So the original church, of course, was just that in all of these windows. And Abner Haydel, who was the architect and had gone to École des Beaux-Arts, sort of did this, looked the arts and crafts, and according to Elliot Lindsley, may not have been a huge fan of too much stained glass. At least it started this way. But there was clearly space built architecturally. And according to Elliot, Mrs. Wing commissioned those three archangels, but I don't know who they did. And Maitland Armstrong may have been asked to take the glass on these two side windows that you can't see, but if you ever do, from the old church, the second church, and make them, use pieces to make a new one. And so that's in the Years of Grace. And then I was looking at these windows in light of that book in Brianne, and so St. Rose windows first in 1910, then the 1912. John died in 1910, Adelaide died in 1911. They were married for over 50 years, born in the same year, 35. And so he died 1 year ahead, and he's going like, I go to prepare a place for you. And where I'll be, there you will be also. And peace I leave with you. That's why we think it was really influenced by the children and that moment. So in 1912, it was done, within a year, because it was dedicated, according to our local newspaper, the Round Table, Easter 1912. Now, that window, the rose window, is dedicated to the young girl, I think she was 7 or 8, who died, who was the daughter of Marion, the daughter of John and Adelaide, who married Dr. Flint. So, Marion Flint was dedicated. That window's to one of the two sons. He had Lewis and Morgan, both of whom lived a long time, and Morgan was the one who did the hunting ground Cinderella and was really a sportsman. Both of them were very influential in Millbrook history. But that window is 1917. And I think it's only one layer, and I think it's a lot of painted, right?
Yeah, so Helen, when it was...
After he died.
Yeah, so when she developed her own style, because she did do windows on her own as well, I mean, Maitland, Armstrong and Company was the two of them, but she did do her own work, and she was far more influenced by the Gothic revival style, which is single. She would plate it sometimes, but really not often. And the architectural canopies is also a very Victorian sort of Gothic revival thing. So that is more the date and sort of the layout and technical aspects of that window would suggest to me that it was Helen on her own who did that one.
Yeah. And he was dead. And so.
Well, yeah. But I mean, the drawings, and you don't know how old the drawings are and stuff, but the painting style is, I mean, like I said, he kind of stayed away from painting figures. I think he was told to in that review, so.
But, So anyway, there's going to be more history about these as we dig into, and of course, you know, the history of the Wing family. You're investigating down at the mausoleum.
Yes.
And I think it's just fascinating to learn more. Any more questions? I jumped in there just
No, please, yeah.
on the Wing family.
If anybody wants to look at anything around, and you know, I could tell you, I hope I did a good job illustrating it, but it's easier to do it live in living color. So if you want to look at anything up close and have questions, I'm more than happy to try to answer them. So.
And to answer the how long question too, we've gone, or we are about to actually sign the contract. We've agreed to hire a how do you call it, a contractor, artisan.
Yes, it's a specialized stained glass contractor.
It's a small world.
Yes, it is a small world. And like any trade, there's better ones and less good ones. So this is a firm that I worked with. I was the stained glass consultant at Trinity Wall Street, and which concluded in 2021, I think. 2020. They did a lot of the work for us there, and they're also using a specialized firm from Needham, Massachusetts called Serpentino Stained Glass. And Roberto Rosa, who's the principal there, he is the best conservator that I know in private practice in America. He's wonderful, because although I'm saying we're doing less, we're having a light hand, the work that needs to be executed takes an extremely disciplined, experienced, careful person, mindful person to be able to do it. And the firms that tend to be more interested in taking out windows and reletting them because they want them to be good as new are not going to be able to do that kind of work with any type of elegance. So we went to the people who we had 3 qualified bidders, but we picked Father Matt picked Feminel and Associates.
We is the general term here. Because
The royal
Brianne developed a huge, it's a big, thick conditions report. She was up there with her associate and just on ladders every inch, on both sides, just drawing up, and then and then we went to stage 2 after she gave the conditions, prepare the bid documents so that everybody was going apples to apples. And that's an extensive packet too. When you do this, how much for that, how much for that. And it's a technical business like you wouldn't believe, and I'm a former contractor. Clearly it is if you just tried to hire the best person, you would be out, it's so good to have you.
Thank you.
As our consultant. And then the work we hope to be done, and they've agreed that it can be done, to dedicate it on Easter next year. So Easter 23. It's not exactly the centennial, added 11 years, but it'll be a grand occasion, I think, because after all, it's a resurrection window, And so as such, it's part of a little bit of a reimagining that's going on for our Memorial Garden. Because, of course, I was a little bit heartbroken when I came, and they had done an analysis of the windows, and like Brianne said, they tend to give you a quote for fixing it up, and I heard $50,000 for that window. I said, I can't see that window. I don't want to. But now somebody had a great idea to turn it around. The organ now will actually be an asset, because you were saying that the Met Museum has these new LED lighting screens that can mount to the back of the organ, be removable if they need to get to it, give even and powerful light, so that you can imagine how beautiful that window will look at night. And if any of you remember the big old spruce out there, of course, you couldn't see it then either. Now the spruce is gone, replaced by a low stone wall memorial garden. There will be also a Celtic cross underneath in the stucco area, and perhaps a contemplative path. So that people coming off the street might be able to walk, come into the memorial garden, and sort of you make the whole journey, right? From journey through a baptismal little fountain, through the cross to resurrection. So that's the plan, and this is a big piece of it, and I'm so excited that we're getting going. So.
I look at a lot of windows, so I was like positively gleeful. I look at so many windows, and of course they're all wonderful, beautiful snowflakes. That's my business platform, but it's nice to see one that really takes your breath away. And although I was like so close in front of it, I couldn't see the whole thing. Once I got it all together, it's really a magnificent. And it's so special with the deviation and iconography. So there's definitely a story to tell here, and it's clearly part of this well loved in this congregation. So.
We think it's art historically very important and just a beautiful thing.
I was very confused
about turning it around.
Yeah.
And apparently, we're supposed to look at it, and this is the right way to view it. But now, we want the people outside
Mhm.
to be able, and that's why it's being
Right.
turned around?
Right. So if you can, we light it up now, and you can see it tonight. You know, it's not very well lit. It's dimly lit. But as you drive down, you see it. But you can't see through the opalescent halo to the face. It's layered glass, so all you get are sort of the dim outlines. And you know, the same is true if you see any of these from the outside, except the old Gothic kind of looks the same both ways. But this way, you know, it reveals itself.
So it'll be the same image, you know, Christ is on the left or the center left and Mary Magdalene's on the center right. It'll be the same on the outside. Christ will still be on the left because they're going to switch positions. So
thing.
that's why we have to manipulate the wood frames a little, because these are 100 and some odd year old wood frames, old growth lumbers. Oh yeah, it's going to be fun, yeah.
Now, the tours have to be arranged. I know, you're disappointed. You'd like to go up right now. Yeah.
Matt, can you speak to the newsstand?
And
Yeah,
let me just say one thing.
Outside.
Because there's a little narrow ladder and...
Outside.
But outside we can look.
Oh, you can, yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's what
I'm sorry.
That's
But
what
if
I'm
you
saying.
would like to get up behind the organ and see it, just talk to me and
Yeah.
we'll arrange a tour. It's a little tiny German ladder to get up.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Oh, would you speak about the new stained glass windows that you're proposing?
Oh, well, yeah, we are, when I came, there was already a plan afoot to give a memorial window in memory of Charles Buddy Johnson. Does anybody remember his story? He was a member of this church, a member of this community, African American, who was a talented musician and athlete, who was drafted because he was denied a scholarship on racial grounds, off to Korea, one of the first interracial platoons. He saved 8 people during a firefight that the Chinese army had overrun their position, including Dave Dingle, a local guy too. Denied a medal for many years, again, racism involved, but through the efforts of General Alderson and others, he got the Silver Star, and I think he's on his way to a Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously. So we've got a small fund of money to create a window in his memory, along with Jonathan Daniels, who was a seminarian in the 1960s, Episcopal, went down to join the civil rights work down in Mississippi of getting voter registration, was jailed. One of his jailmates was Stokely Carmichael. But the one that counted was Ruby Sales, who you may have heard of as well. She's still alive and speak. They walked over to get a soda pop. The guy came out with a shotgun, aimed it at Ruby Sales. Jonathan Daniels stepped in front, took the blast, and died. And we want to remember that. We're also thinking, well, those are 2 good guys giving their life for the sake of others. How about the women? You know? So, anybody vote for Eleanor Roosevelt? Great Episcopalian, part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Anybody heard of Pauli Murray?
No.
Pauli Murray, you should hear about, because she was an African American young woman who was denied and brilliant. Went to Howard. Her grandfather was a trustee of the University of North Carolina. She had a white and black mixed family from North Carolina, but they denied her entrance to the law school. She appealed to Eleanor Roosevelt, who fought for her on her behalf. They became lifelong friends. They still wouldn't let her in. She went to Boston, got her doctorate. Was part of the team that did Brown versus Board of Ed. She was the one who came up with the she did the massive report, the sociological report, that was, yeah, it's not equal. It's separate but not equal. She's part of that team. She went on and said, well, you know, how about Jane Crow? She went on to found NOW, National Organization of Women, with Betty Friedan. She was the co-founder. And working with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, formulated the Supreme Court argument they'd get women's rights. So isn't this an amazing woman you've never heard of? Who then went on to become an Episcopal priest during the first wave of women being ordained, and was down in the Bowery, working in that church until she died. So that's another candidate. But now, where do they go? You know, the process of creating windows in the patron the client, as you said, and finding the right artist is a back and forth. And we've been in conversation with Chris Hunter, as many of you know, and she's developed some beautiful designs. At first I thought, oh, I'll put them on the side of the St. Martin, but now I can't touch it. It's named Armstrong. We have 2 spots next to the Good Shepherd. You there? So, we'll see. These were all done in the 1960s. You see Abraham Lincoln. So we have a Republican. And we have other windows from the 60s along with. If you do want a sort of art historical tour, was it a 14th century?
That's what the book says. Yeah.
So
I have my
somebody donated
questions.
a 14th century piece of stained glass, so it's off to the right, and you can see it too. So anytime you want more of a close look, and Elliot has a little paper on it. Other questions? Alex?
So you said during the process stage, you're going to restore it in place, and just about the final step would be to flip it around?
Yeah, so we're not going to take the lead came apart or dismantle the actual stained glass window, but we do need to remove the wood sashes from the wood frame. So the wood frame could be treated, it, obviously needs it. The sashes will be treated and modified to fit in their new holes. So the panels, the stained glass panels will come out of their wood sashes, but not be taken apart. And then it'll all be cleaned up and modified and it's all being maintained though, nothing's being removed.
So that will be done during the rest, it will be in place while you're restoring it, or you will take it out, restore it, and then put it back in place?
Take it out, conserve, and put it back in place. Yep.
Yeah, when intact, meaning the panels will be intact, instead of taking piece by piece and re-leading it, which is...
Yeah, I mean, the lead work in this window, the plating work is really intricate, and it would be very difficult. It's certainly possible if a good enough glazier was doing it, but why? I mean, that lead is intact, and now that we're bringing it towards the inside and internally venting it, which is going to really halt the moisture issues, why? You have the original hand of Maitland Armstrong and his team who created this window, and there's no sense in removing that. I believe the inherent value of these things is in their original materials and original craftsmanship, and with each restoration you lose that. So you want to, that's why I'm more on the conservation bus of keeping as much as you can. So
the work's going to be done in a workshop?
Yeah.
Elsewhere?
Yes, yep.
Because by being intact, that was a little unclear.
Matt, you're speaking on Saturday about the church and the arts and craft style.
What am I speaking on tomorrow? No, I've been asked...
Tomorrow, right?
Tomorrow at 4 in the parish hall, the Millbrook Historical Society asked me to speak a little bit about the parish hall. And because that's an interesting story too. This is 1901, arts and crafts, built to be a beautiful place of worship. But the parish hall is 1909, different rector had come. There had been a whole movement in town to say, hey, we need to get people, David can tell you more about these people out on the street, and how do you spell trouble? It starts with a P, right? Pool. So they put a billiard room in the parish hall, and they put a bowling alley in the basement. It was built with a bowling alley, and we'll be talking about that.
Like the village hall.
We had Gracie's attic here. I was doing the Saturday sit for it, and this elderly gentleman and his friend came in, wanted to know where the heck the bowling alley disappeared.
Well, we have a picture, but it's now a preschool. So I know I got the high sign, and I know in the last remaining light you may want to see outside. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Oh, and we have copies of the article. If you don't have one.
Such a great job.